Hi there, this is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 14, Part 1. So again, this is a long chapter that has they're all important, but has some important concepts in it that I want to give proper attention to, so I'm going to divide this up. The first section addresses personal relationships and personality types, other people issues, and is also there's also a chapter that I can bring in some information about mental health, let's just say, or sort of relate it to my experience and some of the things I'm reading. And this section also parallels what Lee Glover was talking about in our interview in terms of the geography of where the DeWeese's house is, being in the DeWeese's house, and all that. The second part, we're going to go into some real germane aspects of Pirsic's philosophy, so we're going to save that for next week. We ride down out of the pass into a small green plain. To the immediate south we can see pine-forested mountains that still have last winter's snow on the peaks. In all the other directions appear lower mountains, more in the distance, but just as clear and sharp. This picture postcard scenery vaguely fits memory, but not definitely. This interstate freeway we're on must not have existed then, so we know what that is. That's Friedrich's memory. The statement, "to travel is better than to arrive," comes back to mind again and stays. We have been traveling and now we will arrive. For me, a period of depression comes on when I reach a temporary goal like this and have to reorient myself towards another one. In a day or two, John and Sylvia must go back, and Chris and I must decide what we want to do next. Everything has to be reorganized. So it's interesting the way the narrator says he feels depressed when he arrives. Let's look at something that's been observed in Eastern spiritual practices for a long time and now is backed up with brain science. It is better to travel than arrive. The reward circuits of our brain are reinforced by the actual seeking of whatever it is we're looking for, of traveling rather than arriving. Consummation, arriving, is pleasurable for a brief period, but after that we want to seek again. And Jordan Peterson certainly discovered this in his personality, both personality maps of meaning. He's talked about this. This is, again, inspired by, among other neuroscientists, Jaak Panksepp and his seeking system. So the narrator knows this. The narrator is very wise in the ways of the workings of the human mind and personalities, etc. He's less wise when it comes to having social skills, but the two are not necessarily codependent. The narrator reflects on how this town, Bozeman, is a bigger town than the ones they've been passing through and has a different pace. And you can tell when you're in town, the pace is faster. And there's a certain disconnection with people. They don't look at each other. They don't greet each other in the same ways that you don't see in smaller towns. I expect you don't see much of that at all in the United States, even in the small towns. So, because technology is so infiltrated, the cell phone, that, no matter where you are in America, you see this. Technology is so infiltrated everywhere that the sense of disconnection he's sensing is full-blown manifest everywhere for the most part. I mean, this isn't an absolute, but, think about it. He has some difficulty finding DeWeese's number in the phone book, which brings on a panic due to his memory problems. And his memory problems, of course, this is going to be a theme of this first part to some extent. Friedrich's memory, because DeWeese is Friedrich's friend, and now he's not Friedrich anymore, so he questions his memory. And this also prompts another philosophical observation. It's not the technology that's scary, it's what it does to the relations between people, like callers and operators. That's scary. Okay, so this is done on steroids, what callers and operators did to each other in the past. But then he remembers that DeWeese answered his snail mail, let's just say, letter. And remember those? They did exist at one point. when he wrote to DeWeese and said, and told him he was coming. So he calms down, and they start to arrive in the vicinity of the DeWeese's house. The fields sweep outward and slightly upward to the base of the mountains, where a much darker green of the pines rises suddenly up. That will be where the DeWeeses live, where the light green and the dark green meet. Again, nothing in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is by accident. This is a very carefully written book. So the DeWeeses live where the two climates meet. What does this say about them and their house? Well, one thing, it says that this house is a meeting place, and it's a meeting place well, remember what Lee Glover was saying, that the DeWeeses were the denizens of this art scene oasis in the middle of conservative Montana. So that's kind of like two climates. Another thing it might point to is something we observe about the contrast of Piercig's and DeWeese's personalities. This is the meaning of two types, classic and romantic, but not delineated, not like a rigid kind of, let's just say, a very rigid type engineer, and the Sutherlands were totally romantic. This is sort of contrast of Piercig's and DeWeese's personality, and while Piercig is sort of inclined towards classic, is classic for the most part, DeWeese is inclined towards romantic for the most part, but they do have a significant amount of the other within them, and so that might also point to that. Perhaps they're complementary, and we'll explore this a little bit more in part 2. We round a corner and suddenly enter the pines and a very steep V canyon in the mountain. There, right beside the road, is a large gray house with an enormous abstract iron sculpture attached to one side, and beneath it, sitting in a chair, tipped back against the house, surrounded by company, is the living image of DeWeese himself. So, living image meaning in the narrator's mind, there's a vague recollection from Federer's memory. So now you have the living image of DeWeese himself with a can of beer in his hand, which waves to us right out of the old photographs. That's how the narrator remembers DeWeese, through photographs. So remember how Lee Glover was mentioning that the DeWeese house is in Cottonwood Canyon, and Cottonwood Creek flows right by the house, and this chapter describes it in quite a bit of detail. This is just beautiful, Sylvia says. The living image of DeWeese smiles down at her. Thank you, he says. I'm glad you like it. His tone is all here and now, completely relaxed. So, personality. I realize that although this is the authentic image of DeWeese himself, it's also a brand new person who's been renewing himself continually, and I'm going to have to get to know him all over again. So that's not just Phaedrus's experience. Any of us, when we see an old friend after a long period of time, are going to have to get to know their updated version. And it's important to remember that the narrator is no longer Phaedrus. So remember, this is not the same guy DeWeese knew, and this is going to be the source of some discomfort and misunderstanding, because the Sutherlands never knew Phaedrus. They only know the narrator. To them, the narrator is their biking and drinking buddy. A little odd, but a harmless editor of technical manuals. To DeWeese, the narrator is Phaedrus, a colleague at the University of Bozeman, who they knew was working something major out, something complicated, and it got to him so much. It got so intense, he had a breakdown. Suddenly comes Jenny DeWeese with a tray of beer cans. She is a painter too, and I'm suddenly aware, a quick comprehender. And already there's a shared smile over the artistic economy of grabbing a can of beer instead of her hand. So conversations get rolling. John has a real gift for casual conversation like this that I've never heard, so I just listened. So here we go. The narrator and Phaedrus have such a handle on how John is a type and Sylvia is a type, but little idea of how to engage on the same level. So this is where that type really is doing a much better job, is really got a leg up on someone like Phaedrus, who's much more in his own head, classical, uh, or more mechanically oriented rather than artistically oriented. And let's just say John has the capacity for interaction, for social interaction that Phaedrus lacks, that the narrator lacks. And our understanding is that Pirsig was quite a recluse himself. First we relax, then we unpack. What's the hurry? The beer and sun begin to toast my head like a marshmallow. Very nice. I had to quote that line just because I like it. So, as was mentioned, the DeWeeses have some guests, and they're mostly other professors, mostly art teachers. The conversation shifts into what is current in art and music and theater, and I'm surprised at how well John keeps up this end of the conversation. Again, that contrast. I'm not basically interested in what's new in these areas, and he probably knows it. And for that reason, never talks about it to me. Just the reverse of the motorcycle maintenance situation. Just the reverse of the motorcycle maintenance situation. I wonder if I look as glassy-eyed now as he does when I talk about rods and pistons. Good point. John's good-natured sarcasm toward his old drinking and cycling companion is chilling DeWeese slightly, causing resultant respectful tones towards me from DeWeese. John turns to me and says, "Geez, you must have been really crazy. I mean, really nuts to leave this place. I don't care what the college is like." I see DeWeese looking at him shocked, then angry. DeWeese looks at me and I wave it off. Some kind of impasse has developed, but I don't know how to get around it. "It's a beautiful place," I say weakly. DeWeese says defensively, "If you were here for a while, you would see another side to it." The instructor, the other guy, one of the people there, nods in agreement. The impasse now produces its silence. It's an impossible one to reconcile. What John said wasn't unkind. He's kinder than anyone. What he knows and I know, but DeWeese doesn't know, is that the person they're both referring to isn't much these days, just another middle-class, middle-aged person getting along, worried mainly about Chris, but beyond that, nothing special. But what DeWeese and I know, and the Sutherlands don't, is that there was someone, a person who lived here once, who was creatively on fire with a set of ideas no one had ever heard before. But then something unexplained and wrong happened, and DeWeese doesn't know how or why, and neither do I. The reason for the impasse, the bad feeling, is that DeWeese thinks that person is here now, Phaedrus, and there's no way I can tell him otherwise. And so I'm perplexed by that last sentence. Why? Why is there no way he can tell him otherwise? Why is there an impasse at all? This situation could be easily solved by a little explanation. So the guy they see before him is someone who's been in the hospital after a schizophrenic, that's how it was diagnosed, breakdown, and 30-plus rounds of electroshock therapy. But why on earth is this such a secret? I can only imagine it's a different conception of mental health. We are much more forgiving today, and although there's still a stigma related to mental health issues, especially ones that end up in hospitalization, and although people who have been hospitalized today often feel like they should not disclose this, especially to employers and stuff, nonetheless, this type of information today is shared among people you're close to and friends and family, and you would think that the narrator would be able to tell his good friends about this, or just kind of bridge this impasse. He saw too much, I say, thinking about the impasse. To myself, I think how uncalled for that was. You don't make statements like that. You leave the hospital with the understanding you don't. Okay, you leave the hospital with the understanding that you are sane. So here it's revealed. We see a big difference between the way mental health issues were viewed then and now. In the hospital, Pirsig had to pretend he was cured, and that was critical for his release, and it's critical. He feels like at this point, he feels like he has to keep pretending he's average, normal, in order to function. And that's why, and he kind of has this prejudice in his head a little bit, and that's why he's been so disconcerted by the emerging memories from Phaedrus. although now he's beginning to learn that he might need to sort that out, that there might be some value in rediscovering Phaedrus, but he's not at the point where he can tell his friends. Just sort of hints at it. So Jenny DeWeese shows them to their room, and it's outfitted with thick quilts for the cold summer nights at the DeWeeses, where cold winds sweep through Cottonwood Canyon, even in the middle of the summer. So he asks Chris, "How do you like it here?" He says, "Fine, but it isn't anything like the way you told me about it last night." "When?" "Just before we went to sleep in the cabin." I don't know what he's referring to. He adds, "You said it was lonely here." "Why would I say that?" "I don't know. My question frustrates him, so I leave it. He must have been dreaming." Well, no, Chris wasn't dreaming, obviously. Here's a situation I want to get a little technical about. So I'm going to bring up the same book that I'm always harping about and not yet introduced properly, because I'm still working out how I can fit this in. I'm still working out the parallels with the metaphysics of quality, with Pirsig's philosophy, etc. This is The Way We Are, States of Mind, by Frank W. Putnam, and it's about how states of mind influence our identities, personality, and potential for change. And for me, it's the best model of personality I've seen so far. And at least best modern. I might say Carl Jung, but Carl Jung's very parts-oriented too, so this is sort of a modern way of looking at parts. I'm going to recommend it again. In the meantime, I want to reiterate how this book is about our multiple nature and how the more fragmented our personalities are, the more, let's just say, pathology. One way the personality becomes fragmented, and I'm sorry if you are a survivor of childhood trauma, this is a trigger warning. One way the personality becomes fragmented is with childhood trauma, which can hinder brain development in a way that the ability to dissociate, to completely cut yourself off from any empirical experience, is a survival mechanism. Dissociation. So you can dissociate away from abuse as a child when you have nowhere to go, you know. But because the brain is developing, that proclivity to dissociate becomes hardwired, and then it sort of, as do many childhood coping mechanisms, they become pathological in adulthood, so dissociation. But another way this can happen is through something like ECT, shock therapy, which damages the memory and can create this fragmentation. And memory, of course, is the glue that holds all the parts of our personalities together. So the ECT has caused the split personality between Phaedrus and the narrator, and there is an excellent concept in that book that's really interesting, that applies to all of us, actually, because we're all multiple. It's something that's called state-dependent learning and memory, or SDLM for short. And this means if you're in one state, you learn and remember a set of concepts and facts that may go totally out the window when you're in another state. This happens to all of us. Do you ever feel like you've said or done things that don't feel like you? Like in the moment you find yourself, caught up in something, and maybe you'll do something dumb, and then after it's over, you'll say to yourself, "What was I thinking?" Or especially, do you ever leave a room to go get something from another room, and then when you get to the other room, forget why you went in there, and then instantly remember it when you get back into the first room? It's state-dependent learning memory, LM, sorry. So this is the second time in the book, and I don't know, I can't remember if this has happened already or is going to happen, but this is another time in which the twilight state of falling asleep has triggered the Phaedrus personality. And in the semi-soporific state, it's put the narrator in full Phaedrus mode. In this, twilight state, which is one of the ways a state will switch from one to the other, is in falling asleep or waking up in the morning. Let's just say when you're dreaming and then you wake up, the reason you forget your dreams is because you've switched from one state to another, and the LM is totally different. So when when the narrator wakes, he has no memory of being Phoedrus and talking to Chris the night before about the DeWeese's house. Perfect example of SDLM. But mostly he doesn't dissociate to this degree. He mostly is the narrator remembering Phoedrus in fragments. A single fragment comes to mind now of night winds all around a campfire, smaller than this one before us now, sheltered in the rock against the high wind because there are no trees. Next to the fire are cooking gear and backpacks to help give wind shelter, and a canteen filled with water gathered from the melting snow. The water had to be collected because above the timberline, the snow stops melting when the sun goes down. Okay, above the timberline, and no trees. So remember, Phoedrus was working out this stuff in the mountains above the timberline, and this was Beartooth Pass. Remember, no trees above the timberline. This is a magical place where Phoedrus experienced inspiration from an almost otherworldly source, the high country of the mind, as named by a young Einstein, who himself became a very spiritual and, let's just say, religious person. So there's a religious quality to this high country of the mind. And this fragment is, obviously, is him camping up there. DeWeese says, "You've changed a lot." He's looking at me searchingly. His expression seems to ask whether this is a forbidden topic or not, and he gathers from looking at me that it is. He adds, "I guess we all have. Forbidden topic. You can't talk about it. Too stigmatizing or whatever." That's my assessment of it, but maybe it's not just that. Maybe it's just that it's too scary. I reply, "I'm not the same person at all," and this seems to put him a little at ease. Were he aware of the literal truth of that, he'd be a lot less at ease. Okay, too scary. "A lot has happened," I say, "and some things have come up that have made it important to try to untangle them a little, in my own mind at least, and that's partly why I'm here." Well, this is as close as he is able to get to honestly revealing what he's been through, and it's cryptic as hell. He wants to explain, but again, he can't. He's just too, there's too much of a barrier to explaining the truth. And I guess he assumes that even such hip characters as the Sutherlands, hip romantic types such as the Sutherlands and the DeWeeses, it would still be risky. Chris returns with sweaters and asks if there are any ghosts up in the canyon. DeWeese looks at him with amusement. "No, but there are wolves," he says. Chris thinks about this and asks, "What do they do?" DeWeese says they make trouble for the ranchers. He frowns. "They kill the young calves and lambs." "Do they chase people?" "I've never heard of it," DeWeese says, and then seeing that this disappoints Chris adds, "But they could." Well, we know about the ghosts already. They come up in this book in various forms. And there was the wolf himself, who didn't chase people, but he did kind of chase people. He chased the lambs, the students. He certainly did chase ghosts. After dinner, Jack and Willa Barness arrive. More living images. Living images is quite a way to describe the emergence of his old friends, the Barnesses, and that's how it feels to him. You know, these images in his mind are fragmentary, they're static, and then suddenly they're alive. So there's, again, a lot of conversation going on, and the narrator speaks to a sculptor who is suspicious of his classic mind, his engineering manual writing nature, until they find a point of commonality. They both like to weld. The artist welds sculptures, and we know how the narrator uses a welding torch, his own art. Later I move and talk with Jack and Willa. Jack is leaving to head an English department down in Boise, Idaho. His attitudes towards the department here seem guarded but negative. They would be negative, of course, or he wouldn't be leaving. I seem to remember now he's a fiction writer mainly, who taught English rather than a systematic scholar who taught English. There was a continuing split in the department along these lines, in part, which gave rise to, at least exhilarated the growth of Phoedrus's wild set of ideas, which no one else had heard of, and Jack was supportive of because, although he wasn't sure he knew what Phoedrus was talking about, he saw it was something a fiction writer could work with better than linguistic analysis. It's an old split, like the one between art and art history. One does it, and one does it, and the other talks about how it's done. And the talk about how it's done never seems to match how one does it. Well, this split is going to be very important in chapters coming up. And there is actually a way to match what's done with how it's described, and that's the art of rhetoric. A good rhetorician can very much give the feeling of how something is done through expression. You've already found that Pirsig has a lot of capability in this area. He certainly can describe the way things are done and make it feel like you know what he's talking about. So rhetoric, this will come into play soon enough. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next Sunday for Chapter 15, Part 2.